Yeah, so happy to be here today, and Stephanie Dudley and I will touch on this one together. Part of my job is to work across the directorates, so I work closely with the Science Mission Directorate and Space Technology Mission Directorate, but also within our own directorate, Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate. So Stephanie and I work closely to ensure that utilization, basically the research that we'd like to do using the Artemis architecture uh, traces from the directorates that hold those objectives and can be implemented within our own directorate. Next slide, please. I like to show this slide. Some of you have probably seen presentations from us before. Just to drive home the point that these are the instructions we have, right? The United States will maintain its leadership in space exploration and space science. Science and exploration together in the same kind of header right there. This is what we're doing. And it's also important to note that this came from the Space Priorities Framework in December of 2021. We're in a position right now where we've actually gone through a political party change and maintained our direction. So this is tremendous for us. We don't go to the moon in 4 years or 8 years. So having support broadly from the United States government gives us that strong base to continue forward, exploring the moon and learning to live and work in space. Next slide, please. So Najud just talked briefly about the Moon to Mars goals and objectives. I'm sorry, this has a series of steps. So step through maybe 3 or 4 more button pushes. Yeah, one more. And the goal that we have here, and many of you have probably heard Pam Melroy speak about this, is to basically start building a blueprint for sustained human presence, basically out in the solar system, out away from low Earth orbit. And that's what our directorate, Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate, is largely tasked with. But we're trying to kind of change the paradigm of how we go about this. So instead of starting with the things we want to build, we're starting with what is it we want to go do out there. And so Najud just talked about the collection of inputs for the Moon Mars goals and objectives. This was a large effort over a year of collecting input from community, working with our directorate partners across NASA to document this content. So you can trace to it here, and I think what I'll do also today is probably send something to the Lunar L to make sure that everybody can find links to get to this information. Next slide, please. You've seen this slide already twice today. If you haven't seen it, you're just joining. I think it's really important to show this slide over and over. All of us think about this from a slightly different perspective, but this is, asking the question, what is the benefit to humanity for exploration? And we've talked about the 3 pillars that hold this up: science, inspiration, and national posture. And science is a really important part of that. So understanding what it is we need to accomplish to meet the science objectives. And so if you joined at the beginning, Nikki Fox and Jim Free were talking about this from the perspective of the Science Mission Directorate and the Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate. How do we integrate? One thing I do want to address, in a number of recent meetings, public meetings, there's been some confusion suggesting at points that there's very little integration between science and exploration, even suggesting that there's no integration. I do want to be very clear. We have developed organizations inside NASA to ensure that we are connected, that the objectives that are flowing from our stakeholder directorates are tracing into exploration systems so that we build the right things, make the right strategic decisions that enable us to go meet those objectives. So I just want to be really clear about that. We are integrating. The Moon to Mars objectives are a big first step in that. That is each directorate looking to its community to help provide the content from which those objectives were derived. All those community documents, all the work that's been done recently, tracing back years to even decades, all of that content is what helped drive those objectives. So just, if you hear someone say that there's not integration between science and exploration, please go ahead and correct them in future discussions. Next slide, please. Just show here real quickly the more of the detail about those objectives. This is some of the content that we have. There are recurring tenets, things that are common across basically all the thematic areas. But we have lunar and planetary science, 4 major objectives there: heliophysics, human and biological science, physics and physical science, science enabling objectives. So not just doing the science itself, but what do we need to have in place in order to do that? And then applied science. Next slide, please. And there are a few more. Lunar infrastructure, and Najud talked a little bit more about this as well. The infrastructure as we look farther beyond the moon, key things like transportation and habitation that we need to understand, and then understanding operations. How do we go about doing the work to meet those objectives? So this just gives you a sense of how we've captured that information. These are the objectives that Najud talked about that we're now trying to break down into individual capabilities, needs. What are the pieces that need to be in place to help us go ahead and meet these? And that's the step that's really important, because it will help us understand which next investment moves us forward on as many of these objectives as we can. And that's what we're really trying to do, is help inform what are the right steps to do next. Next slide, please. So around that, we start to make decisions about hardware, and that's what the architecture is. It's that functional set of functional capabilities and building elements from them that helps us go out and meet the objective. So in Artemis 1, we tested out the Space Launch System, the Orion. We learned how to use our exploration ground systems. We're looking forward to developing habitation in space, life support capabilities, the overall infrastructure. There were questions earlier about base camp already today. I mean, these are the things that we have to think through, and as was asked in that question, learning the science as we go, so we make the right decisions about where to put infrastructure. Infrastructure we can reuse, so that we can start spending more and more time on the surface to do more and more science, which then just continues to inform us so we can make the next decisions for our investments on that architecture. Next slide, please. Now, from those high-level objectives, we can distill that down to individual mission objectives. And so the science, the research, the technology demonstrations that our directorates carry as part of those Moon to Mars objectives then trace into what can we actually do on a single mission. So Artemis 1, again, we flew late last year, very successful mission. Jim Free mentioned some of this. We had a set of CubeSats, and as Nikki said, we've learned varied amounts of information from each one of those. But overall, we learned about how to take advantage of opportunities that we may have as we continue to launch missions on our way to the moon. We also had payloads inside the Orion capsule that were helping us characterize the space environment that our astronauts will be expected to operate in as they try to meet those science objectives in the future. Understanding the radiation environment, vibrational characteristics they'll deal with, how to operate the Orion, and then understanding what happens when biology is exposed to that radiation. All key pieces of science that become sort of that backbone around which we can inform and wrap our architecture. So mission by mission, we break down what we can accomplish based on the capabilities that are present. And that's where I work with the other directorates to get that information. And then I work with Stephanie Dudley to help go about implementing that on a mission by mission basis. Next slide, please. And so with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Stephanie, to talk to you a little bit more about the implementation at the mission level.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Yeah, so hello, I'm Stephanie Dudley. So I'm the Artemis utilization lead. So working with Jake and the mission directorates to implement all of your user requirements within the programs that make up the Moon to Mars program office. Next slide, please. So as we've heard today, science is why we are here. Our team is making this happen. So we already have a really strong relationship, as Jake alluded to, with the mission directorates. I'll just add that includes the Space Ops Mission Directorate, where the Human Research Program lives. and SMD and STMD that we've already talked about today. So we're advocating for your requirements and making sure those get put into the Artemis campaign requirements, um, providing the key mission resources that you need to do your research and technology demonstrations. We have a process that we're going to talk about here in a minute that we came up uh, with help from the science and technology users. And then we have also implemented a common user interface that will allow you to operate seamlessly between the different vehicles. We've already begun this process for the first human landed mission, and obviously Gateway will launch with multiple payloads in addition to that. So next page, we'll talk about the process. So this is mission agnostic. The goal that we're trying to get to from the strategic planning that Jake and the users have been talking about this morning, all the way to execution. So we start with our mission. Where are we going? How many crew members? What vehicles are going to be on that mission? And based on those kinds of details, we can estimate the resources that will be available, things like crew time and mass available to the mission directorates. And then the USIG, which is the ESDMD, SOMD, SMD, STMD, a co-chaired working group will release a call for Artemis utilization. And then they do a negotiation between the mission directorates to come up with allocations. And then those results get approved by the Quad DPMC. And then each mission director will go out and they will do their solicitations, perhaps do directed research. And during that time, my team is available to help with feasibility consultations as you're scoring solicitations or making choices about your directed research. We can help with what is actually implementable. So once the mission directorates make their selections, we start documenting all the details about what everybody needs, what, not just the mass and the crew time, but all of the different resources that are required to execute your payload. Those get documented in the Artemis utilization plan, and that will be approved by the Moon to Mars Control Board. And then from there, we have, all of the things that it takes to get ready, from crew training to flight rules, writing the procedures, all the way up to our flight readiness reviews. Next page, please. So a little bit more about payload integration. Once you've selected a science or technology demonstration, we will assign a payload integration manager to help walk you through this process. All of your unique verifications, your safety reviews, all the documentation that you'll need, attending the meetings, that's a service that we will provide, and based on your needs. And so we have a lot more details that we could talk about in this process, but we are short on time today. I just want to highlight what Jake has been saying, that we are very integrated between the user mission directorates and the actual Artemis programs who will be implementing your research and technology. So that's all I had for today. Thanks.